Okay, we're here talking to Jim Lamb. Jim, tell us what you work on here.
So I work on TeamBuild, which is the build automation component of Team Foundation Server, and today I'm going to walk you through some of the new features we've done for the 2010 release.
Okay, so we saw you on Channel 9 a couple years ago. You were showing us what you were working on for 2008. You added continuous integration, lots of cool stuff.
That's right.
So what have you done in 2010?
So we've got a bunch of new features in 2010. We've made some fairly big changes, and 2008, as you may recall, was a relatively small release for Team Foundation Server overall, and the CI functionality we added was pretty significant, but was still, was really the only feature we added in 2008, that with the drop management facilities and so on. With 2010, we've got a bit of a watershed for TeamBuild. So if you recall, in 2008, the entire build process was actually driven by MS-Build. So we actually had a project file, an MS-Build format project file, that drove getting the source code from version control, kicking off the build, associating work items and change sets, running tests, copying files to the drop location, and so on. Now that worked really well. It does have some limitations. One of the limitations in particular that we didn't like was there's no way to run it across multiple machines. So if you want to, let's say, build debug on machine A, retail on machine B, there's no real good way to do that with MS-Build. MS-Build is, it's one process that runs on one machine.
Right. They parallelized MS-Build but only for a single machine.
Yeah, so it's multi-processes on one machine.
Right.
So that's a great point. It's a great feature in MS-Build, and it has some great performance benefits. If you have projects in a solution that don't have conflicting dependencies, they'll build them in parallel, which is terrific for us. But like I said, it doesn't really let you take advantage of multiple machines, and for a lot of customers, it's a really big deal to speed up their build and get better build performance, especially when you're building daily or more often. So that was a big requirement. The other thing we really wanted to do was we wanted to have a visual design experience around the build process itself. So instead of driving everybody to go into an XML file to define their build process, we wanted to give them something a little more visual, where they could see the structure of the build process, they could drag and drop, copy and paste, share processes across build definitions, and so on. So we've made a lot of progress in that area, and what I'm going to show you today is still sort of placeholder UI, to be honest, because this particular release was originally going to ship ahead of the .NET 4 framework, and then there was a point where we synced up with the .NET 4 framework. And so we originally were targeting the early version of Windows Workflow, the original version. Now we're targeting the version that's going to ship with .NET 4. And it's got some terrific new functionality, new features, including a brand new designer that's all built in WPF that's very slick. So we're in the process now. We've in fact just started up a new feature crew that's integrating with Workflow 4.0, that's figuring out how to rehost that designer in our UI so you can use that, and it's taking advantage of all the cool new Workflow 4.0 features.
Awesome.
So that's going to be great. But in the meantime, we've got a pretty good placeholder UI that kind of gives you the general gist of what we're trying to do, and I'll show you that today. And we've also got a number of other features that build on the Windows Workflow Foundation. So that was kind of the first work we did for 2010. The next big feature we did was a feature we refer to, at least right now, I'm not sure what the marketing guys will come up with when it ships, but it's a gated check-in. Okay. And essentially the idea is to validate your changes before they get committed to the repository by building them on the server and making sure that not only they build, but the tests pass and whatever other criteria you have, whether it's code analysis or what have you, that all works before your changes go into the actual repository. Right. So it's a really great feature, and it's something that we do internally. For those folks who, Channel 9 advocates who are out there who've heard of Gauntlet at Microsoft internally, it's very similar to that. It's a little bit more flexible in some ways. And the way it works is pretty cool too, and I'll get into that in more detail when we do the demo. And there's a related feature to that called Buddy Build, which is kind of the same idea, but it's not mandatory. So gated check-in is something that once you turn it on, and you can always turn it off, and if you have the right permissions, you can even override it, but once you turn it on, any change that gets submitted that affects that build definition is going to get stopped. It's going to get verified through a server-based build, and then either committed or rejected. Buddy builds, or shelf set builds, are a way to take your changes, shelve them, queue a build to the shelf set, make sure it's not going to break the build, and then check it in if you choose to. Okay. Or you can just check your work at the end of the day if you just want to make sure you haven't broken anything. So it's a really nice way to just do a sanity check on your changes.
Okay, and you're supporting buddy builds as well. That's not just a dev div thing.
That's right.
Awesome.
That's going to be a shipping feature, fully supported. The other really cool feature that we have actually just finished up is integration with Symbol and Source Server. So for those of you who have seen the Proteus tool, and it's actually the better known name is the debugging history tool window in Visual Studio in the developer SKU. That's a great solution. It allows you to capture a log as you run your application with rich debugging information about what's going on in the environment, what your application is doing, values of variables, call stacks, and so on, and then essentially play it back in Visual Studio as if you were debugging live. And that's a great tool. When we first started looking at it, we realized, oh, it doesn't work if you built it on the server with TeamBuild because you don't have all the debugging information locally. It was only built on the server. Maybe it was even a different workspace, different versions of the files, and so on.
Sure.
So you might see the debugging history, but when you go to actually open up something in the call stack, it may not go to the right location.
Right.
In fact, it probably wouldn't.
Right.
So what we did was we did some work to actually make TeamBuild interoperable with Symbol Server. So if you've got Symbol Server in your environment, and it takes very little to set up, really all you need to set up is a UNC path, share, and you're done. So you do that, you go into one activity in the build process and you set that UNC path for where to put the symbols. And it'll take care of storing the symbols in there at the end of the build. It'll take care of fixing up the PDBs, the debugging files that go along with your build, and making sure that the debugger knows how to get the correct version of the source code from our source control. So I'll walk you through what the experience is like, but in a nutshell, you can take a TeamBuild, you can run it, you can either remotely run it or run it on some other machine somewhere, and then you can attach your debugger to it, and with just a couple minor configuration settings on the debugger, you can get it to where it can fetch the correct version of the source from TFS.
Great.
Really easily. So
awesome.
Really slick feature.
Well, I have to say TeamBuild's one of my favorite things to demo, so I'm excited to see what you've got in store for us. Let's jump right in then.
Okay.
All right.
So I have set up a demo environment here for this Channel 9 video that's got just a really simple solution. In this case, it's just got, I'm going to go ahead and load it up here, it's just got a simple console application and one class library. So I'm not going to tax the system too much here because I don't want to spend our demo time waiting for builds to complete. But that's what it looks like, and I've got a pending change in there right now. So first what I'll do is I'll walk you through the workflow design process, since that's the first thing we talked about, and that's kind of the underpinning for everything else I'm going to show you. I'm going to edit this build definition, and you'll see a lot of familiar UI here. You'll see the build definition name and description. If I go down here to the trigger page, you'll see the same triggers that you saw in Orcus.
Yep.
So there's CI, there's rolling builds, gated check-in is new. Scheduled build is still there as well. I'm going to go ahead and turn gated check-in on for right now. The workspace mapping, that's the same. Build defaults, this is a little bit different. This is actually a feature I didn't talk about yet, so this is one I'll talk about now real briefly. The other limitation with Orcus that we weren't crazy about was the fact that you had to specify a single build agent for each build definition as your default. And what that meant was that when your CI build got triggered, even if you had multiple machines to work with in your build environment, it's always going to build on that same machine. And if you've got a build that takes a little while, well, you can get builds that get backed up, and next thing you know, you're waiting an hour, 2, 3 hours for your build to actually complete after you check in. So what we did was we decided to create pools of agents, and the pools of agents get managed by a build controller. The controller represents that pool, and that's what you associate with the build definition. Instead of a single build agent, you associate a controller, which represents a pool of build agents.
Okay.
So now, and when I go into the process tab here, I'll show you how you create affinities between parts of your build process and particular sets of agents in your pool. But that means you can now distribute your build load across a number of machines, however many machines you happen to have.
Okay. Does that mean that how does it get distributed? Is it like a single build can go across multiple machines, or is it that you're doing one build over here and one build over there?
You can actually do either.
Okay.
So I'll talk about that in a little more detail in this process tab, because this is really where you really see the the context for how the build is structured.
Okay.
So this is the build workflow designer, and again, this is not what's going to ship in 2010, but this is essentially the idea. This is sort of our placeholder UI while we were waiting for the workflow 4.0 bits to get finalized. And what we've got here is a root activity. And for those of you not all that familiar with Windows Workflow, I'll try to explain some of these terms as I quickly go through it. But the root activity is sort of the container for everything that happens during the build process. And it has some top-level properties like which solutions and projects to build. This sort of maps to the old wizard we had in Orcus in 2008.
Oh, sure.
The test to run, and there's some other properties on there as well. And then within this, there's this activity called select an agent and build. And this activity is where we actually pick an agent out of the pool to execute this subset of the overall workflow.
Okay.
So over here I've got a property called reservation spec, and in this property I can actually, let me expand this, I can specify a particular agent, and you can see I've got one agent here defined in this particular pool. And the star represents any agent, so any agent can be used. I can also specify tags. Now this is a new concept in 2010 as well, where you can assign tags to build agents. And a tag might represent something like, this one has BizTalk 2006 on it, this one's got SQL 2005 on it, this one, you know. So if you have some dependencies in your build environment, you can tag your build agents with those dependencies so that your build process knows, okay, well for this part of the build I need this kind of agent.
Gotcha.
So that's how we manage that. And then within this activity, we've got a set of activities that drive sort of the detailed build process. So you can see we're initializing the workspace, we're creating the label, the compile and test portion does some work here. And speaking of the symbol server integration that we mentioned just a minute ago, this is the activity that drives that. Now this is actually a container activity, indexing the sources and publishing the symbols. This is a sequential activity underneath of which we've got the actual work to find the symbol files, to find the PDBs, to index the sources, and then to actually register those symbols with your symbol server UNC path. So,
but these are all workflow. What do you call them? Tasks or?
They're actually workflow activities.
Activities
is the term that Workflow uses.
But these all ship out of the box. I don't have to do anything special here.
That's right. All these activities over here in the toolbox that you see, the agent scope activity, and all these activities here are all in the box with TeamBuild. And we've also got some other activities that are planned for 2010. Can't absolutely commit to the fact that they'll ship in the box, but for the most part it's looking pretty favorable right now.
Okay.
We will have some new functionality that people have been really asking for, so that Wix will be supported out of the box for generating MSI packages.
Oh, nice.
We're going to have support for MS Test without installing the actual test SKU on the build machine.
Oh, wow.
And hopefully we're going to have support for DB Pro activities like test data generation and schema deployment.
Okay.
So that'll be included in the build agent, so you won't have to install DB Pro on the build agent to get that functionality.
Now what if I have legacy, well I'll call them legacy, I guess the technology is not legacy, but what if I have MS Build tasks and targets that I still want to use? Can I do that?
You can absolutely do that.
Okay, great.
In fact, so this whole build process you see here is managed as a template, as a build process template. And we actually have an Orcus upgrade template that does just that. So you can imagine in Orcus, the entire build process is driven by that tfs build.proj file that's MS Build compatible. For our upgrade template, we essentially have just a very simple workflow that, down here, if I drill into this compile all projects a little bit, you'll see there's a run MS Build for project. And this is the part of the process where we actually run MS Build.
Okay.
So for Dev 10 for 2010, there is no proj file per se. Like if you've just got a set of solution files with projects underneath them, we build that and there's no extra proj file required.
Okay.
If you've got a proj file that you've created yourself or you've migrated from 2008, you can use that too, and you can go ahead and just have us build that. In fact, that's a nice practice in a lot of cases to go ahead and sort of create a simple proj file to sort of just wrap up what you're trying to build, and that way you can do some really nice MS Build level customization.
Oh, okay.
So we're kind of giving you, two layers here. We're giving you sort of all the power of MS Build still, because it's a great tool and it really excels at the compile link process. And then we're also giving you this rich orchestration level functionality where you can bring to play multiple machines across your network. You can do more sophisticated, kind of workflow type things, and creating work items and waiting for the states of things to change, and calling web services and stuff that doesn't really make sense in the context of MS Build. So this is, like I said, probably the simplest workflow thing I can show you. This is the simple build template we ship in the box. Down at the bottom here, we've got this check-in gated changes, and that relates back to the gated check-in feature I mentioned earlier. And this is conditional, and you'll see a couple activities here too that are gray, that have a gray background. That's because for any of these, you can actually disable any of these activities. So if you don't want to do one of these things, it's as simple as just going over here and setting the enabled property to false.
Oh, okay.
So that's very simple.
So if I only wanted a debug build as opposed to a retail, that's what I would do.
Sure. And then you can even filter by reason. So we have this new concept in Dev 10 in 2010 around the reason the build was triggered. So you can see here there's batch CI, that's rolling builds, checking into shelf set, that's gated check-in, individual CI, manual, schedule, etc. These are all different reasons the build can be triggered. You can conditionalize this so that certain activities only occur under certain trigger conditions.
Oh, that's great. I wouldn't even know how to begin to do that with MS Build.
Yeah, so if you just wanted to, part of your, maybe you have a set of tests you only want to run on your nightly, you don't want to run as part of your CI build.
Sure.
Really easy using that mechanism. So, so that's the workflow designer, and I'm going to cancel out of that now. And I'm going to show you in a minute how to make a distributed build, but first we'll go ahead and queue an instance of this because I want to show you another couple new features. So we talked about the ability to do a buddy build, to essentially take a shelf set and queue a build of that shelf set. You'll see here I've got a way to queue the latest sources with shelf set or just the latest sources. So if I choose shelf set, it's kind of hard to say, shelf set. I get this UI where I can browse for a shelf set, and it filters by my name, and oh, there's my shelf set I want to build. I'll select that. And you still get a lot of the same options here. The build agent is again replaced with that controller instance, so that's different. But now I can go ahead and queue that, and it's going to queue a build of that shelf set. And one difference between the sort of public builds that we do that are CI builds or manually queued builds of what's in the repository, because a shelf set build is built against something that's not really directly available to everybody else, it's your shelf set, we do it as what we call a private build. Private builds get their own retention policies. Any build that you do that's a private build isn't necessarily visible to everyone else, although you can still share it. So if you want to, let's say, build your shelf set with your changes and then hand them off to test so they can verify your fix before you check it in, real easy to do with this, and you know that it's good because it's a server build. Let me go ahead and open up this because here's some other new features. Another new feature I didn't really mention. This is the new build details view.
Oh, that looks nice.
And this is actually really simple set of results because it's a simple build and there weren't any problems. That's the idea for the good case. You want a really nice simple build report. But it gives you here a history of previous builds, and the color coding is an indication of the status of the build, so green is successful, as you might guess. The height of the bar here is relative to the duration of the build. So the bigger the bar, the longer the build took to run. If I hover over one of these, I'll actually get a tooltip giving me the build name, the status, and how long it ran for. I can even click on one of these and it'll open up a new build details view of that build, so I can see that. And there's also a log view where I can see all the details. And if I expand all here, you kind of see you can quickly browse through the log.
Oh, nice.
And then there's links in here for, like in this case, we've got where we invoked MS-build, and if you still want to get the raw MS-build log file, you can still do that. If there were any errors or warnings here, and I'll show you what that looks like shortly, you would actually see those highlighted in red or yellow as appropriate, and it makes it really easy to jump to where those are in the log.
That's cool.
In fact, let's go ahead and introduce a build problem just so we can see what that looks like. So let me go ahead and introduce a problem here.
That won't compile?
That won't compile, I'm pretty sure. So, full pending changes. I'll say check in. Check that in. Oops, I actually didn't check in my actual change. Let's try that again. Okay. And now I have that set up as a CI build, so it's already building. And this first build I think will actually succeed because it was not a breaking change.
So you've got it set to build every check-in then, so
right,
that's
so
why we're getting 2 extra builds.
That's right. So
okay.
this one is running now. This one is queued up behind it. So I'll show you what a build looks like when it's in progress. So while it's in progress, you don't get that summary view. You just get the log view until it's actually complete. But you get some action links up here. You can stop the build while it's running, of course.
I love that view, though. It's so much nicer than what we have today.
Yeah, it's a little bit cleaner, and I think you'll really like when you see how errors and warnings show up in it. So now this one's running. We'll open this one up. Because of the fact that we did that simple server and source server integration, now when you get, even if my local workspace was different from what was in this build, when I pull up the build report and I see an error or a warning, it'll show the error code, the actual error text, the file and line number as a hyperlink.
Oh, wow.
I can click on that. It'll actually open up the correct version from source control.
Wow.
So you see here, this is what I was talking about in the build log where errors are highlighted in red. And you can see that over here in our little mini map, we call it, shows up very obviously. And then here we've got, this is what I was talking about, so here's your links to your errors. So very readable, depicted as hyperlinks. I can go ahead and click on one of those. And it's going to take me directly to the line.
That's awesome. That is really cool.
And again, you'll see up here, it's not even my local version. It's pulled that from source control. It's got the change set version in there.
Wow.
So it's showing the exact version. So that's a pretty cool feature.
Oh, yeah.
And now I can go ahead and I can fix that. I'm going to make sure this actually works and that we don't have a bug here. Oh, it didn't show up as a pending change, so no, it should have gotten that from my local workspace and it didn't, so that's a bug. So this feature crew is actually not finished yet.
Okay, all right. So we'll give them a break here.
Yeah, we'll give them a break. We've got a couple bugs still in this feature crew, but we are getting ready to finish this up in the next couple weeks. Let me go ahead and fix that real quick. But that gives you the idea of how that actually works.
That's great.
Check it. And before we check in our change, I'm going to go into my Team Explorer here, and I'm going to go ahead and show you my nightly build definition, because this one's a little bit more sophisticated. And we'll build this one next.
Okay.
This process, you'll notice, has 2 select an agent and build activities. And I've labeled one debug and one release because that's just what it does. It builds the debug on one agent and the release on another.
Okay.
Now, unfortunately for this environment, I've only got one agent to work with, so these are going to actually execute in serial fashion. But if you can kind of apply your imagination to the problem,
right.
If you had multiple build agents in your environment, this would very easily execute in parallel. And the only difference here from the other build, other than the fact that it's got these 2 activities instead of just one, is that the copy outputs to drop location activity is actually creating a subdirectory off the base drop location, one for debug, one for release, so that the drop is getting copied into the appropriate subdirectory. Otherwise, they'd be clobbering each other. So that's the only sort of tweak you have to make when you're doing a distributed build. But it took me all about maybe 2 minutes to set this up as a distributed build.
I can imagine. So when it does distribute, what is the algorithm for picking which machine it uses? Is it simply round robin, or is it looking at the spare cycles on that machine to figure out which one to go to?
So it's basically round robin. So it looks to see, first of all, are there any machines that are idle, and then it round robins across the idle machines. If there are machines that have queued builds behind them that it's waiting on, it'll pick the one with the fewest queued builds.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So it tries to optimize for just build completion, but it doesn't have a lot of information about build agent load and so on, and that can kind of vary depending on what else the agent might be tasked with doing, if it's a dedicated machine or not. But that's something we're looking at down the road, is having sort of better telemetry around the build process and be able to capture more of that data so we can make better decisions about which one to use. So, let's see, I showed you the simple server integration, source server integration. I showed you shelf set builds, gated check-in, which talked about the workflow designer. The other option is the other feature that's kind of interesting here is now you see I have this deleted build. Now, okay, I know what the problem was, so I'm not really interested in keeping that build around. If I click delete build, you'll see some new options here. And again, this is UI that'll probably change before we actually ship, but we've got a number of artifacts related to the build now, and there are good reasons why you might not want to delete all of them all the time. So you might want to leave the symbols, you might want to preserve the label so you can reproduce that build at some point, you might want to leave the drop, and so on. So we give you pretty granular control over this now. And not just here, where I'll delete this build, but also if you look at the retention policies tab of the build definition UI, you'll see the same options here. I get a choice of what to delete, and I get some simple options that I can just pick off the list, or I can do it in fine-grained control and pick exactly what I want the retention policy to clean up.
That's cool.
And just a note, so previously when you deleted a build, it deleted all record of it, so which wasn't really consistent with the way that work item tracking or version control works. You know, when you delete something in those feature areas, it's not really deleted, right?
Right. So you can go back and audit later or what have you. Yeah.
So we've actually mirrored that same functionality in build now, where deleted builds are actually still addressable. So there's still sort of a record in the database that's marked deleted, so it doesn't show up, you don't have to look at it. But there is a record of it there. The core build information is still in the database, still accessible.
Okay.
We do have a command line tool that's consistent with the way TF destroy works, that works against builds. So it's TFS build exe. There's a destroy option where you can clean up those deleted builds if you choose to.
Okay.
But you have to make that explicit choice. Otherwise, we just preserve that information. So I showed you the build details view. So that's in a nutshell kind of where we're at with TeamBuild for 2010. So a lot of new features. Windows Workflow is a key element of it. Features that we have planned between now and the end of the cycle, because we still have a little bit of time left. I talked about the Workflow 4.0 integration. We're going to be using their visual designer in our UI. That's going to be a nice experience. We're going to have a simpler, so I showed you that visual designer around the build, and that's nice, but for people who just really want to do a simple build process, just want to pick the solution to build and the test to run, even that's kind of overkill. So what we're doing is we're creating, again, a sort of multi-layered experience where if you can still do the MS build level stuff like we talked about. If you're a workflow person and you want to get in there with the visual designer, or even go in and edit the raw example that is the underlying workflow, you can do that. If you just want to get your build up and running with a minimum amount of fuss, you will have a new UI in the build definition UI that lets you configure what we call arguments to the build. And the arguments would be things like solutions to build, test to run, code analysis settings, how to format the work item on build failure, all that sort of stuff.
Okay.
And you'll have a nice simple UI to configure those properties of the build that will just drive the build template. And we'll also have a set of templates to work with that ship in the box, and we'll plan on making it easy for partners and even for ourselves to ship additional templates out of band so that you'll be able to get that value post-RTM.
Gotcha.
So lots of new capabilities there. We're also doing a little bit of permissions work. One of the things that you still don't see in the build definition UI is really granular permissions. We're going to have at the build definition level a way to set permissions so that you don't have just team project level permissions for build. You can say, okay, for this build definition, this is who can see it, this is who can edit it, this is who can turn on gated check-in, this is who can modify the workspace, and so on. So you'll be able to control those things in a more finely grained way if you desire. And that's pretty much it for TeamBuild 2010.
That's awesome. So I realize you probably haven't coded up the whole experience around gated check-in yet, but what happens if I check something in and it fails?
That's right. Let me show you gated check-in. I didn't show you that. And we do pretty much, it's not final, but I will show you what that looks like. Let me change this trigger to a gated check-in trigger. And let's go into our program CS here, and we'll add another line here. And then we will check in our change. And actually, before I do that, let me run another little program that you may have heard of.
Is this the tray tool?
Yeah, this is the build notification applet I'm going to start up, and we don't actually have it in the start menu yet, but I will run it separately. If I can remember where it is. Okay, it's in private assemblies. Build notification. There we go. Okay, so let's go and configure this real quick for our Channel 9 project. And that's no longer a power tool, that's actually going to ship in the 2010 release,
nice.
just so you know. So now I'm going to check in my change.
Did you save that file?
No, it should probably, it's okay. So this is the UI you see when you submit a change that affects a gated build definition.
Okay.
You're going to be shown the shelf set that it's going to create with your changes, and it's in here in such a way where you can copy and paste it if you want to refer to it later. Mm-hmm. It's going to show you the build definition that it's going to build. Now there is there's a scenario where you might have a set of changes that affect multiple build definitions, and in that case we're going to ask you to pick one because we don't really have enough information on the server to determine which one is the right one.
Okay.
So we're going to leave it up to the user to pick that. And you have some other options here. You can preserve your your pending changes locally, which is generally a good idea, and we set that by default. And you can also bypass the validation and just check in directly, which requires a special permission to do, but there's an option to do that as well.
Okay.
But I'm just going to go ahead and say, okay, build my changes, and it's going to take me to the Build Explorer so I can see my build in progress. And that'll take a little bit of time to run, and then once that build finishes, if it succeeds, it'll go ahead and take my shelf changes and commit them to the repository on my behalf. So they'll still show up as checked in by JimLamb, checked in by whomever submitted it.
Okay.
And you'll also get a notification from the tray application that'll tell you that your changes were either they were submitted mm-hmm. or they were rejected, depending on whether the build succeeded or failed. And another great thing about 2010 that I should mention is, previously the idea of a partially successful build or a failed build was pretty much hard-coded, so if the core compile succeeded, then it was at least partially successful.
Right.
If no steps failed, so here you got your check-in committed notification.
Oh, nice.
This icon we haven't fixed up yet, so that's programmer art. But from here I can also do this. We have this thing reconcile workspace, because you remember we kept our local changes mm-hmm. as pending in our workspace. So we need to fix that up now. We need to reconcile that with the fact that, well, now they've actually been committed to the repository.
Right.
So I'm just going to click the reconcile button here. It's going to fix up my pending changes. And it's going to ask me to go ahead and take the new change. And there it goes. It's no longer pending.
Nice.
It's been submitted. And now if I bring up this build, you'll see there's my associated change set that got checked in. That no CI comment, we have that for obvious reasons. That prevents the CI build from getting triggered, but we're going to be removing that.
Okay, because this is another check-in that
right.
would otherwise be built.
Yeah, you don't want to create that endless loop, right, of builds, but we'll do that under the covers, and you won't actually see it as part of your comment when we actually ship 2010. But that's the gated check-in experience. It's
That's
really
great.
Very simple.
So no more broken team builds, no more having to throw in money to the pizza fund, none of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the great thing about gated check-in. I mean, there's there's a point where you kind of have to turn it on. You know, if you have enough developers working on a single branch, if you don't turn something like this on, you're just going to be dealing with build breaks on a constant basis.
Sure.
So it's a great way to circumvent that and get the build into a good state and keep it there. So terrific new tool.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, I'm really excited. Looks like you guys have made some, once again, awesome investments here, and we'll let you get back to shipping the product.
All right. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Jim.